My name is Annette, and most people would call me successful at the age of 26. I work as an investment manager in one of the leading companies in the city. I have a decent rented apartment, but I also have a good job and enough savings to finally buy my own place. Soon, no mortgage, no loans, just what I want. Everything was going according to plan until a phone call from Aunt Sarah changed everything. "Annette, darling, are you coming to Thanksgiving this year?" Her warm voice made me smile. Aunt Sarah was more of a mother to me than my real mother ever was. "Of course I won't miss it," I replied, imagining the taste of her famous apple pie. But what I didn't expect was who else would be there. I should probably explain why this call meant so much to me. You see, I haven't spoken to my parents or my older sister Daniela for 8 years, since the day I graduated from high school. I just received a letter of acceptance to a college with a partial scholarship to study investment management. I was over the moon with happiness. That was all I worked for. I rushed home to tell my parents, expecting their pride. Instead, I was waiting for a conversation that would tear our family apart. "We can't pay for your college," Mom said, without looking up from the magazine. "Your sister is getting married soon, and we need all our savings for her wedding." I remember how my voice trembled. "What about Grandma's money?" "She left them specially for my education." "You promised her." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Things are changing, dear. Daniela's wedding is more important now. You'll figure something out." That's when everything I'd been holding back for years came out. Daniela has always been more important. Always the first, always the best, always in the spotlight. The argument that followed was disgusting. Years of feeling second-rate resulted in accusations, screams, and tears. That evening, I packed my things and left. The only person who ever treated me fairly was Aunt Sarah. She accepted me without hesitation. I didn't know then that she was saving money for her son's education. But he died in a car accident a few years ago, and she offered me the money. I agreed, but only on the condition that I would pay her back every penny as soon as I graduate and find a job. The college years were tough. I worked in a cafe, kept my grades good, and kept my scholarship. But I did it. She got a job at a prestigious investment company. 2 years later, I paid off Aunt Sarah in full. Life was wonderful. Independence, a thriving career, your own path. And no contact with the family. Until the bell rang. I almost dropped the pumpkin pie when I entered Aunt Sarah's house. My parents, my sister Daniela, and her children, 6-year-old and 3-year-old boys, were sitting in the living room. I froze in the doorway. My heart was pounding. Mom looked older, her hair had turned gray. My father gained weight. Daniela is still the same golden girl, even with 2 children hanging in her arms. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know they were coming," Aunt Sarah said softly, looking at me guiltily. I stood on the porch of my childhood home, feeling the cold winter air permeate my bones. The gift bag seemed heavier than it really was, as if it was absorbing the weight of all the years of silence, all the words that had not been spoken. The house seemed smaller. As a child, he was the whole world to me, with cozy rooms, the smell of cinnamon and freshly baked bread, and warm hugs that, as it seemed to me at the time, were meant only for Daniela. Now its facade is tarnished, the paint is peeling, and my mother's once perfect garden has turned into a tangled maze of dry branches and weeds. I took a deep breath, slowly raised my hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if they were waiting for me. Mom was standing in the doorway. She looked older than I remembered, with deep wrinkles around her eyes and lips. But the eyes remained the same, gray-green, sad, full of something that I could not immediately read. "Annette." Her voice trembled, and she pressed her palm to her chest, as if she couldn't believe that I was really here. "Hi, Mom, I replied, smiling tightly. She stepped forward, as if she was going to hug me, but froze, not daring. This movement, this pause in the air between us, suddenly seemed painfully familiar to me. How many times during my childhood have I waited for her to hug me, praise me, and tell me she was proud of me? But I'm not a child. I haven't been waiting for a long time. Mom stepped aside, inviting me in. Come on in, honey, I made your favorite apple pie. I walked into the house, feeling the scent of cinnamon and baked apples evoke memories. Everything here seemed strangely familiar, and at the same time alien. It was like I was looking at the scenery of the past, but I knew it was just an illusion. My father was sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper, but when he heard footsteps, he immediately put it down. He looked up at me, full of some strange tension, as if he didn't know how to start this conversation. Hi, Annette, he finally said, his voice lower than I remembered, with a hint of tiredness. Hi, Dad. We looked at each other, and I felt like an abyss of years stretched between us, woven of innuendos and resentments. At that moment, Daniela's children ran into the room. They froze, looking at me curiously. The older boy, aged 6, looked like an exact copy of his father, a high forehead, attentive gaze. The younger one, a chubby-cheeked wonder with dark curls, held out his hand to me, as if expecting me to reach out in return. Hello, Aunt Annette, said the elder. Aunt. The word rang in my ears, foreign and at the same time strangely pleasant. Hi, I smiled weakly, extending my hand to him. Daniela came out of the kitchen. She still looked immaculate, even in a simple sweater and jeans. There was uncertainty in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if about to say something, but changed her mind. I'm glad you came, she finally managed, and her words hung in the air between us. I nodded. Mom hurriedly went to the kitchen. I'll get the tea now, you can settle down for now. I sank down on the old sofa, the gift bag still clutched in my hands. Dad coughed, clearly nervous. How's your job? What is it? He asked after an awkward pause. I knew he was trying to find something to hold on to, something that could connect us. Okay, I replied, without going into details. Mom brought tea, and a plate of pie was placed in front of me. I looked at it, at the golden crust, the neatly sliced slices of apples. The taste is familiar, from childhood. I picked up my fork and took a bite. The same as before, I muttered, and Mom blushed with joy. I remember that you loved this one. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. The whole evening was spent in conversations, in careful phrases, in attempts to find common ground. Daniela talked about the kids, Dad was interested in my work, Mom was fussing all the time, pouring me tea, as if she was afraid that if she stopped, I would disappear. I didn't know how I felt. Pain? Anger? Is it warm? I watched my father tinkering with his grandchildren, and my mother laughing at something Daniela said. I noticed the wrinkles on her forehead, the trembling in her hands, and the noticeably empty house. Have they been happy all these years without me? Or did they miss me as much as I missed them? When I left, Mom lingered at the door. Will you come again? I looked at her. For the first time in many years, I saw in her not only the woman who once betrayed me for Daniela, but also the person who also suffered. I do not know, Mother. She nodded, accepting my answer. But there was hope in her eyes. Life was gradually moving into a new direction. The awkwardness that had held us in a vice during my first visit was disappearing, giving way to something more sincere, albeit fragile. Sunday dinners with my parents became a habit, and I no longer caught myself thinking that I was telling off the days before them with anxiety. Daniela came to my office more and more often. We were sitting at wooden tables in the courtyard, drinking coffee and talking. Conversations were no longer strained. We laughed, recalled childhood, discussed the news, complained to each other about work worries. She told me how Emily wants to become a scientist, and how Jack never leaves his dinosaurs for a minute. I could feel the bond between us being restored, and it was amazing. It's even nice. Mom tried too. She called me in the evenings, asking how her day was. Sometimes I just talked about some little things, that new books had been delivered to the library, that the neighbor's cat had given birth to kittens, that she had found my old sweater and, it seems, washed it 10 times before she could wash the stain that I had put on back in school. I was listening. I didn't always know what to say in response, but I listened. Spring came unexpectedly. I barely noticed how the days got longer, as the sun no longer hid behind leaden clouds, but illuminated the streets with a soft golden light. On one of these days, I received a message from Daniela. Dad got sick. We're in the hospital. Please come. I didn't think twice. The hospital greeted me with the sterile smell of antiseptic and echoing footsteps on the tiled floor. I found Daniela in the hallway, her face pale, and her fingers nervously tugging at the sleeve of her sweater. What happened? A heart attack. But doctors say he's stable. Her voice was trembling, but there was hope in her eyes. He wants to see you. I nodded, swallowing the sudden lump in my throat. When I entered the room, my father looked tired and haggard, but there was something warm in his eyes when he saw me. You came, he breathed. I sat down next to him. Of course she came. He nodded slowly, closed his eyes for a moment. I do not know if I have ever told you this. His voice was hoarse, cracking. I'm proud of you, Annette. Very. My chest felt tight, as if something inside me had collapsed. These words. I've been waiting for them all my life. I took his hand, for the first time in many years. Thanks, Dad. That day, I realized that everything had really changed. After discharge, the father changed. He no longer worked, now he devoted his time to his family. We began to walk in the park more often, to sit in the garden, which my mother began to put in order. Daniela helped him with the kids, and I often came just to sit next to him. On one of these evenings, when we were sitting in my parents' living room, and the aroma of mint tea was wafting from the kitchen, my mother suddenly broke the silence. Dad and I decided to sell the house. I whirled on her. What? She looked at her father, and he nodded. We thought it would be better to move into a smaller apartment and sell this house. I looked around the living room, where I spent my childhood. Old furniture, faded photographs on the walls, the armchair by the window where Grandpa used to sit reading the newspaper. This house was a part of me. But I understood. I understand, I said softly. Mom smiled. You will always be a welcome guest here, wherever we live. I know. In the summer, we helped with the relocation. Daniela was organizing boxes, and Mom was running around with notes on what to put where. I found my old notebook with children's drawings, when my name was written on every page, and I caught myself smiling. We became a family again. I didn't know what would happen next. But now I no longer had any fear of the future. I was sitting by the window, arms crossed over my chest, peering into the gray evening light that cast soft shadows on the walls of my apartment. My apartment. That wasn't the case now, though. Over the years, I've gotten used to this place, to its sounds and smells, to the creaking of the old parquet in the hallway, to the way the morning light seeps through the blinds, drawing stripes on the kitchen table. It was my refuge, my territory, a place where I could be myself. And now I had to leave him. I sighed, reaching for my phone. Of course, I had savings. I was always careful with money, even though I helped my family. I never spent more than I could afford. I always saved. I thought ahead. I opened the real estate listings app and started browsing through the options. Everything was embarrassingly expensive. Rent prices had increased, and although I could afford it, the idea that I would now pay twice as much for a smaller apartment seemed unfair. I flipped through the ads, but nothing caught my eye. There must be something better. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Annette? It was Daniela. Hello. Are you okay? You sound good. It's like you're thinking about something. I thought about it for a second. I need to find a new apartment. The hostess asks to vacate the house in a few months. What? There was genuine surprise in her sister's voice. Damn, that's terrible. Have you found something yet? Not yet. Everything is either too expensive, or it just doesn't fit. A second of silence. Move in with us. I almost dropped the phone. What? Well, Daniela took a breath. Mom and Dad and I have a spacious house now. The kids love you, and to be honest, we could use some help. It's not forever, just until you find something suitable. I froze. To move. To your parents' house. I've spent so many years moving away from them, building my independent life, proving to myself that I don't need their approval, their presence, their care. And now? I do not know, Daniela, I muttered, feeling something inside me protest. Just think about it, okay? She said softly. Okay, I replied, although I wasn't sure if it was true. I kept looking for an apartment for the next few days, but nothing came up. Some options were too far from work, others required long-term commitments that I wasn't ready to take on. One evening, I sat by the window again, looking out at the lights of the evening city. My gaze fell on the desk lamp that Aunt Sarah had once given me. Are you happy, honey? Then I replied that I did. But now? I remembered how Emily and Jack hugged me at Christmas, how my mom proudly told the neighbors that I was helping the family, and how my dad held my hand in the hospital. Maybe home is not the place. Maybe the house is people. I dialed Daniela's number. Hi, she said, clearly surprised by the late call. I'm moving out. There was silence on the phone, and then, really? Really? Oh my God, Mom will be so happy. Daniela laughed. Just don't fanfare, okay? No fanfare, I promise, she replied with a smile. I looked at the walls of my apartment. She no longer seemed as familiar as before. Now my house was waiting for me in another place. I was standing in front of my parents' house, holding suitcases in my hands, and a dull, heavy feeling was growing in my chest. It didn't look like anger. It wasn't a disappointment. It was a realization. I've rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, replayed it in my head in my dreams and in reality, imagined all possible scenarios, their excuses, attempts to pretend that this is a misunderstanding, or, worse, complete denial. But no matter what they said, I knew one thing: I couldn't stay in this game anymore, where I was being used as a convenient source of money. I took a deep breath, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. Mom was standing in front of me, her face lit up with a smile, but when she saw the suitcases, she froze. Annette? There was surprise and alarm in her voice. I stepped inside. We need to talk. Where are Papa and Daniela? Mom stepped back, clearly sensing something was amiss, but not daring to ask. They're in the living room. I went in. Dad was sitting in his armchair, reading the newspaper. Daniela was checking her phone. Both of them looked up when they saw me, and their gazes first brightened and then darkened when they saw my determined gaze and the suitcases. Are you going somewhere? Daniela asked first, frowning. I put my suitcases against the wall and folded my arms across my chest. No. I'm leaving. The silence was so thick that you could hear the old clock on the wall rattling loudly. Leaving? My father asked, his brows furrowed. Yes. I'm leaving this house and this game. I saw Mom tense up. Annette, what are you talking about? I paused, then said in a flat, cold voice. That I know everything. That you talk about me behind my back, call me an ATM, and brag to your friends that you no longer need to work because I provide for you. That my money has become a matter of course for you. The words fell into the air like stones, heavy and inexorable. Who told you that? Daniela asked sharply, and I heard a note of panic in her voice. Is it important? I crossed my arms over my chest. I figured it out myself. It was enough just to look at your behavior, how every time it came to money, your requests became more confident, less grateful. Annette, you've got it all wrong, Mom interjected, hurriedly taking a step forward. It's just a joke. We're a family, we help each other. I laughed, a short, joyless laugh. Family? I wonder, Mom, when was the last time you asked me how I was feeling? Not how much I earn, not what plans I have, not when I can pay you for new household appliances or Daniela's trip, but how do I really live? She opened her mouth, but there were no words. My father frowned at me from under his glasses. We didn't force you to help, you offered it yourself. Yes, because I thought it was part of the family to support each other. But now I understand that your family is just a convenient cover for you to live at someone else's expense. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. It's not like that. Then prove it. I cocked my head to the side. Tell me at least one time when you were worried about me, and not about how much I could give you. Silence. I nodded, lowering my arms. Exactly. Daniela jumped to her feet, her face pale. So you're just leaving? Like this? After everything? I looked at her. Yes. What about Emily and Jack? They love you. It hit deeper than I expected. I loved those kids. But I couldn't keep living a lie just for them. I will not disappear from their lives. I will remain an aunt to them. But I won't live here, I won't pay for everything you want, and I won't turn a blind eye to what you're doing. I picked up my suitcases. I'm leaving. Mom stepped forward, her face pale, her lips trembling. Annette, please. I looked at her one last time. I was hoping that we had become a family. But family isn't just about when it's convenient for you. I turned around and walked out the door. It was cool outside, but the air felt fresh, clean, and liberating. I took a deep breath. I didn't know what was coming next. But I knew one thing, now my life belonged only to me. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few minutes settle on my shoulders. Aunt Sarah hugged me tightly and pulled back a little to look into my eyes. There was no surprise or shock in her gaze, just immense sadness and understanding. Are you calling someone? What is it? She asked softly, glancing at my phone. I nodded, scrolling through my contacts. Yes. My voice sounded steady, but there was still a dull echo of pain inside. I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. I found the number I needed, and my fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. A heavy lump formed in my chest, but I forced myself to press the call button. The beeps took an excruciatingly long time. I was starting to think he wasn't going to answer the phone, but then a familiar voice came over the speaker. Annette? James, my boss, sounded puzzled. You're calling late, is everything okay? I took another deep breath, sitting up straight in my chair. Yes. No. I laughed briefly, feeling the remnants of adrenaline tremble in my voice. Listen, I know that I didn't leave the company in the best way, but I need a meeting. He was silent for a couple of seconds, then asked, "Is it related to work?" "Yes." There was another brief moment of silence before he finally answered, "Good. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Be in the office." I closed my eyes and exhaled. "Thank you, James. I won't let you down." "We'll see," he replied, and there was a hint of interest in his voice. I hung up the phone and looked at Aunt Sarah. "I'm going to get my life back," I said softly. She smiled, squeezing my hand. "I've never doubted it, honey." I got up earlier than usual this morning. Despite the long evening and the weight of the experience, I felt strangely cheerful. It wasn't joy or relief, but something else, determination. I chose my most formal navy suit, made up immaculately, and pinned my hair into a neat bun. I needed to look flawless, confident, and unwavering. When I entered the office, I was greeted by familiar faces, some surprised, others wary. I ignored their stares, heading straight for James' office. He was sitting at his desk, looking through some papers, but when he saw me, he put them down and motioned for me to sit down. "Well, Annette," he clasped his fingers together and leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." I straightened my back, folded my hands in my lap, and met his gaze. "I want to go back." His eyebrow twitched up. "Just like that?" "I understand that my reputation was tarnished after leaving, but you know that I'm good at my job." He looked at me appraisingly. "I do not deny that you are a talented specialist, Annette. But there is no place for emotions in our world. You'll have to prove that you won't let personal problems get the better of you again." I nodded. "Give me a chance and I'll prove it." James studied me in silence, then picked up a pen and began to draw something on a piece of paper. "There is one option. A temporary contract. 3 months. No guarantees, but if you can handle it, maybe we can discuss something more permanent." It was all I could do not to let out a sigh of relief. "I agree." He nodded, signing the papers. "Welcome back, Annette." I walked out of the office, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: my life belonged to me again. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment with a clarity I hadn't experienced in a long time. Morning light streamed in through the huge windows, glinting off the freshly painted walls, and for the first time in a long time, I felt really relieved. I no longer had to please people who only saw me as a source of money. There was no longer any need to wait for the approval of those who were never going to give it sincerely. I was free. But freedom is not only the absence of shackles, it is also an awareness of what to do next. My life began to take on a new shape. I focused on my work, not for the sake of providing for others, but because I really loved what I was doing. The temporary contract offered by James soon turned into a permanent position. I proved that I was worth this place, and deep down I felt that I had never been as good at my profession as I am now. There was something liberating about working solely for yourself, without looking back at other people's expectations. My name was back in corporate circles, clients started coming in on personal recommendations, and one Friday night, James stopped me at the exit of the office. "Do you have a minute?" I nodded, even though I was about to leave. "Have you heard about the offer from the head office?" "What's the offer?" He smiled. "The position of senior investment advisor. This is a step forward, Annette. Not just managing client portfolios, but developing top-level strategies." I looked at him, trying to process what he had just said. "They are." "Are they looking at me?" "They want you." My fingers tightened on the leather handle of the bag. "That means moving?" James nodded. "To New York. We're talking about a new level. About another life." I was silent, thinking about his words. New York. A new city, new opportunities. A completely new life. You have time to think, he added, noticing my silence. But not too much. I nodded, and he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. This evening, I invited Aunt Sarah to dinner again. She came with a bottle of white wine and her usual warm, understanding look. Is something wrong? What is it? She asked as soon as she stepped through the door. I laughed. You're reading me like an open book. Well, you look like you have a million thoughts in your head. We sat down at the table and I told her about the offer. She listened attentively, then put the glass down on the table and looked at me for a long time. What are you going to do? I took a deep breath, realizing that the answer had been in my head from the moment James brought it up. I'm leaving. Aunt Sarah smiled, but there was something like sadness in her eyes. I knew you'd say that. I reached out and squeezed her hand. You will always be my family, regardless of the distance. She smiled faintly. I know, honey. But will you let an old woman get a little sad? I nodded, and we toasted the future. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. I submitted my resignation, despite the fact that the management tried to leave me. I sold the furniture, left the apartment keys with my agent, and bought a one-way ticket. As the plane took off into the sky, I watched the city shrink below, and I felt only one thing. I had never been so close to my real self.